Hey everybody, hope you all are having a great tea day. Today we have Garrett again.
Hey everybody.
What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about oolongs, and specifically kind of like, should you age? Why should you age? Looking into aging oolongs. That's our main topic today for discussion.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different from our normally very Pu'erh-centric topics.
Yes.
And I guess the first sort of question is like, can oolong age? Is that like a thing?
I would say so, yeah. So a few years back, James and I went to Taiwan, and we had a chance to kind of try out a bunch of really high-quality Taiwanese oolongs. And I would say some of the ones that really stood out for us were ones that had been aged. I think when you're looking at your overall kind of collection, aged oolongs kind of offer a really unique experience, especially when compared to aged Pu'erh or other aged haichas. So definitely, it's something that you can age.
Yeah, but why? So I guess one of the sort of conversation points we had set out for today was like, oolong can age. I totally agree with you. Some of my favorite teas that I own are aged oolongs. I enjoy drinking it whenever I'm in Taiwan. I shop for at least a little bit of it. Right. Taiwan's a place where there is a lot of aged oolong.
Yeah.
But why does Pu'erh? Why is Pu'erh like this huge thing, whereas aged oolong is kind of like this weird? At least in the West, but I get the feeling this is also representative of kind of at least pockets of East Asia as well. Is that like,
sure.
Aged oolong, it's not really like at nearly the size as like Pu'erh or aging Pu'erh or anything like that.
Right, and I think there's a couple of reasons why that is. From my perspective, as somebody who started collecting in the West. And looking at kind of the history of Pu'erh collecting, I think Pu'erh has there's more of a brand recognition. There's a little more provenance, you could say, if you're relating it back to wine or something like that, where you can single out a factory, you can single out a year, you can single out a specific area where the tea was sourced. And with oolong, you don't necessarily have all these information. You might be lucky if you knew the name of the guy who roasted the oolong in the 90s or something.
But you probably don't.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that therein lies kind of the value and the interesting aspect when it comes to kind of aging tea and collecting aged tea. With oolong, you don't necessarily know that, so there's that mystery.
Right.
And I think for when it comes down to drinking the tea, I think it changes your experience, especially when you're starting out, because you can. I know for myself, I gravitated towards things where I could read about the kind of the history or the narrative behind the tea, and kind of latched on to I really like this one area of Iwu, and I'm going to be looking for this type of tea, and I want the leaves to be this big, and or have it be a blend of this. And with oolong, you don't really have access to that information, so it's a little more, I don't know, I guess it requires you to be a little more tea experience focused. So when you're brewing the tea, is it actually good? What do you taste? How is the roasting process?
Right. So yeah, I guess I touched on a lot there. I feel in oolongs, as you've said, are kind of inherently more just white label tea. Mm-hmm. Teas that are sort of you may or may not know very much about them, so you judge them sort of closer to a case-by-case basis. Whereas, you might go into a Pu'erh with more sort of prejudged expectations. You're like, oh, this is a 2004 Shagwan that supposedly has Banjiang material in it. And you might say, oh, a Shagwan, maybe it has a little bit of smoky, barbecue-y stuff like I've had in other Shagwans. maybe it's Banjong, so I know that's strong, it has a fast Hui Gan. So you go in with sort of all these preset expectations,
right.
Whereas Oolong is just kind of like some dried up leaves, and like especially if it's an older Oolong, you may not even know what year it is.
Sure.
It'll be like the 1990s, but
Yeah.
that could be 1990 or 1999, if it's even accurate. So,
right.
So it's just sort of inherently a white label experience. I like to think of it somewhat as like, for me, I like, it's kind of hard to deny, but like I don't really like to be identified as a tea collector.
Sure. Yeah.
I'd prefer to be a drinker, and I think Pu'erh is just much better for people that are collectors. We have like things called stamp collectors, where you buy one of each different cake. You get a nice wrapper. You get a little Neife, that inner ticket. You can sort of like check off the box. It's sort of like someone that likes to get a lot of stamps on their passport. They like go to Europe, go to all these different countries,
sure.
sort of collecting stamps. I kind of think of it as a similar thing. For me, I actually really that sort of thing does not appeal to me.
Right.
And Oolong is kind of the same way. It's like you don't really like. It's harder to collect. It lacks a lot of like that marketing sex appeal that like Pu'erh would have, where it's like, oh yeah, I don't own any Shagwan, maybe I should buy one.
Right.
And you can make these sort of like constructs for Oolong. It's like I want an aged Dongding, I want an aged Baozhong, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But it's less built in, certainly into the marketing. And you think back to Pu'erh, it's like even 100 years ago they had issues with fakes, and it's like there are good labels, there's some tomfoolery and stuff like that.
Right.
So a lot of that sort of like, I don't know, collectability aspects and stuff like that sort of baked into the Pu'erh experience, certainly in the contemporary Pu'erh world.
Right, and kind of touching on that idea of collecting versus drinking, I think oolongs are a great place to start. If you're thinking about shifting your focus, maybe you've grown a collection of tea, maybe it's all Pu'erh, maybe it's a lot of specific stamp collecting aspects. So I have a bunch of this from this one time period or this one area, and I have like this spectrum, and like this is all fine and dandy. But when it gets down to the drinking process, I think Oolong's a great place to start, because it's you don't have access to that branding, that sex appeal you were talking about. So it's something that allows you to focus back in on the experience, and it's like a good reminder of something that is centering, I guess you could say. And I think with Oolong, especially for folks in the West, there's some like differences in terms of how you would go about aging that too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of different information, especially a lot of information being passed around right now, especially about how to age Pu'erh in the West, and a lot of it's still very theoretical. And I think with Pu'erh, I think one of the challenges is that, and I'm not sure that people think about this enough, is that you are actually fermenting it.
Right.
It's aging, but you're also fermenting it. It's like a product where you want that sort of process to be ongoing. And so it's a challenge, because people that are aging / fermenting Pu'erh in East Asia are dealing with, for the most part, pretty different climate conditions than we are in the West. So that's why we have these all little weird little setups that we've created, and I'm sure it seems all very bizarre to someone that's actually out there. But the whole idea is to sort of get conditions that are closer to what we know has historically worked. For Oolong, on the other hand, the process is very different, and maybe you could say how we saw some people aging Oolong out there.
Yeah, so Taiwan is a humid place, and so when we were there a few years ago, one of the main ways we saw people kind of aging their oolongs or handling their oolongs was like constantly vacuum sealing, constantly keeping everything sealed. Specifically, like some places that were more oolong focused would have like giant drums of oolong, and keep those kind of like those canisters that you would slide the top off of. So like as they would press the lid down on these giant drums, maybe like 50-gallon kind of things, the air would like it would vacuum seal. So the idea, or one of the main focuses, it was that we saw was kind of like when we were in Taiwan, was like that people were trying to keep out the moisture as much as possible.
Right. Yeah, and within those canisters, they would have like these giant Ziplocs, essentially, where they would keep the individual teas.
Right.
And that's really the enemy of aging oolong is moisture, and you just really want to keep the moisture out. So in that sense, the West has a really big advantage versus a lot of places in the East, where for us, we want to get our pu'erh so it's wetter, it's more humid, and that can be a challenge. And sometimes our solutions can lead to disaster.
Right.
But for oolong, on the other hand, we want to keep those leaves dry. And that is the key to aging it in a lot of ways, is making sure that your leaves never pick up any humidity or moisture, and what they'll usually do is they'll turn tart and then sour, and that's, a little bit is okay in oolong. Some people like it, but in general it's better. Humidity is your enemy. You want to keep it out, and so the West, a place that is naturally just much drier, is far more well suited, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinion, towards storing oolong.
Right, and when you're storing oolong in the West, I think it's easier because of there's a lot more dry climates available for folks. They don't have to change or add anything specific, like overly specific to a setup to make it ready for oolong. Like specifically for myself, I use like a mason jar, kind of like this.
Exactly like that.
Exactly like that. In fact, I have some oolong in here right now. And I don't do anything really extra in this setup to take any extra air out. But you can see like a traditional ball jar like this just has the seal, and then there's a little, and then you just close it. I'm not like boiling this or sealing it in any sort of like traditional canning function or anything like that. I'm literally just using what's available to me in terms of like these glass jars. Glass is really nice because it doesn't impart any sort of flavor or material over time to the tea. So it's something that I've been using for several years now to just hold my oolong. And I haven't noticed any kind of disastrous effects. I live in Seattle here, and it can be rather humid various times of the year, just because we do get a lot of just moisture constantly. So it's important to me to make sure that like I'm keeping my oolongs separate and in an environment that does not have air. And this has worked out so far.
Yeah. So I think that touches on the next subject, is that aging pu'erh is just in general much more difficult out here than aging oolong.
Yeah.
Aging oolong, you can just fill up a mason jar, For me, I use washi tins, which you can see over there on that side of the screen right behind Garrett. I just fill them up, and you want to make sure, if you did use a mason jar, you want to make sure it doesn't get light exposure too much like that.
Right.
But, I mean, it's really quite simple. You fill it up. One of the advantages of rolled oolongs also is that it's very space concise, so you can fit a lot of it in. Pu'erh also is very compressed, so that's another nice thing about that. So, So why do you think people are not aging oolong more in the West?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to that idea of like branding and narrative. So when somebody's starting out with tea, and maybe they're more focused on like that collection aspect, or they're in more of an acquiring mood, I think it's easy to fall into those kind of branding assumptions or assumptions about narrative. So like really latching onto a place, latching onto a year, latching onto a type of storage or a type of blend. And I think that has been beneficial, especially for a lot of Western vendors who press new Pu'erh cakes, because they're able to brand in a specific fashion. They can say where something came from.
They can create a fancy label.
You got it, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's that narrative, which I think is attractive for somebody who's maybe used to more traditional kind of like retail experiences, like in the West, who kind of wants to know what they're getting into. Oolong, on the other hand, I think is a lot more difficult to market, and I think there's a lot less of it just in the West, and so that kind of contributes to the fact that there's less people into it.
Yeah, right. I'll push back slightly. I'm not sure that there's less people in the West that are drinking Oolong. I think it is a different circle than we travel, so to speak. But I think people are mainly buying it to drink.
Right.
And you think about Pu'erh, and it's like, you really can see this behavior a lot, where it's people just like, oh my god, I love that wrapper, I'm going to buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like and that has zero to do with the tea and a lot to do with the marketing and the collectability of it.
Right.
Right. The last thing we wanted to touch on was just a little bit about like selecting an oolong that you would want to age, and sort of what is like the age profile. So we were just drinking an aged oolong right here, and how would you describe the profile of it versus like a oolong that maybe was just recently produced in the last couple of years?
Yeah, so the tea we were recently drinking definitely has theoretically a few decades of age on it, and the main profile that I would say kind of it presents whenever I brew this tea is roasted. It's definitely a roasted tea. I still get that kind of like that one specifically. I get kind of like a toasted coconut flavor off of it. But that's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for anything that's overly green, anything that's overly floral immediately. When I'm looking for like oolong that I think would be good to age longer, I think that this oolong specifically also doesn't have any sort of sourness to it. So if you do or are considering something that already has age on it, I think it's an important thing to kind of pay attention to that, because it's indicative of the quality of the aging that has already gone on, as well as the roasting process.
Right. And I think aged oolongs also pass the non-gender specific MON test very well. I think it's a tea that's a lot easier, I think, for most people to grasp than Pu'erh. And I think also, if you just keep in your mind that, sourness equals stored with humidity.
Right.
I think that's extremely easy to pick up on. For me, the profile of aged oolongs really can be very sweet. Some of them can pick up more ginseng-y type stuff. But for the most part, my main experiences with Taiwanese oolongs, the higher notes will age off, and you're left with sort of like a really sweet, oftentimes fruity and sort of a dark plummy way taste, and ideally with minimal tart sour flavors. And that's sort of what it ages into. It's hard to know the exact trajectory for these teas, but yeah, to talk a little bit about the material to age. So keeping in mind that you just want to minimize the internal, basically, moisture within the leaves. So for me, I think the safest way to do that is to select something that's been produced fairly recently, that has been roasted, with the idea being that the roasting process will help to get rid of some of that moisture.
Okay.
I don't think you need to choose something that has been really roasted. I think you just need to choose something that is light to moderate roasted, just to know that it has a roast. I think you probably could age some high mountain oolong that's been processed greener,
right?
But there's a greater risk especially if you're like me and you can't necessarily tell how much moisture is left in those leaves. I think you could run the risk of it turning sour.
Yeah, sour over time, and then you might have to experiment later on with like re-roasting, which some folks do get into, but that's also its own kind of pathway that is difficult and requires some skill.
Right. Yeah, and that is one of the other ways in which aged oolongs, in my opinion, become a lot less interesting. Is if sure your oolong is old, but if it just tastes like roasted to hell, then it's a different profile than this sort of like sweet plummy. It needs to be, if it is going to be in the re-roast category, it needs to be in a way that balances the tea still, and it continues to give it an aged taste.
Right, so that way you're still giving it something to age into, instead of it just being like, and now I have like this very charcoaly roasty tea that may be aged for several years,
but it's so fucking roasted you can't tell.
Right.
Yeah. So that as well as the sourness are sort of like the two. Mm-hmm. I don't like those categories as much.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Garrett, on choosing material to age? Or
I think we pretty much covered it. We talked about kind of like the tasting and what you look for in an oolong that is good to age, light, medium roast. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
And for me, I look at my collection and I realize that I've been highly susceptible to Pu'erh marketing and stuff like that. Just in the sense of like, I really like aged oolongs, and it's a tea that it really should be aging. But I look around and I own a lot more Pu'erh than I do aged oolongs. So despite not wanting to be a collector and more of a drinker, I think I certainly fall into many of those traps. So for me, I think I might be buying a little bit of roasted oolong to age in the future.
Okay.
Yeah,
that sounds like a plan, dude.
So I will update you guys if I do indeed pull the trigger on something like that. I'll let you know which tea I bought and whatnot. So thank you all for tuning in, and cheers.
Cheers.